Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the WCPT Congress, and specifically, welcome to the Focus Symposium on Global Physical Activity Transitions, Emerging Measurement, and Therapeutic Opportunity. My name is Mark Tremblay. I'm from Canada, and I have the privilege of chairing this session. We're right on time at 8:30, and we'll be done by 10. But we do have a full agenda, so I'm going to get going here. So again, the session we're talking about here, in case you're in the wrong room, is Global Physical Activity Transitions, Emerging Measurement, and Therapeutic Opportunity. I'm not a PT. I don't come from a PT perspective, and that might be obvious as we go along, but throw out some challenges to the profession. The last two speakers are PTs. The learning objectives of the symposium are to describe the physical activity transitions occurring in high, medium, and low-income countries, including the putative individual, societal, and environmental factors contributing to the transition to sedentary living and the implications for injury and rehabilitation. To discuss the importance of physical activity behaviors to therapeutic treatment and success, concepts such as behavior compensation, sedentarism, non-exercise activity thermogenesis will be explored in the context of acute and chronic treatment and prevention strategies. And finally, to describe methods for measuring and monitoring physical activity for individual patients, groups, and populations, including assessing relative sedentary, light, moderate, and vigorous physical activity at home, work, play, and in transit. So that's what we're going to try and achieve over the next hour and a half. The symposium format is summarized here. I'm Professor Mark Tremblay from the University of Ottawa in Canada. I'm going to provide a high-level, 30,000-foot overview of what it is I'm talking about with respect to physical activity transitions, why that might be important, and try and bring it down a little closer to where it might have some resonance at your individual clinical practice. After me was supposed to be Dr. Vincent Onywera from Kenyatta University in Nairobi, Kenya. Unfortunately, Dr. Onywera can't be here. I also have an academic appointment at Kenyatta University. I'm a close colleague of Dr. Onywera's. I will provide his presentation for you, so you're stuck with me for the first two presentations. Then Dr. Shuichi Obuchi will present third. I'll introduce each of the speakers closer to their presentation time. He'll be talking about the importance of physical activity measurement and promotion to prevent frailty and geriatric syndrome. And finally, Professor Esko Malkia from University of Jyväskylä in Finland will talk about practical suggestions for physical activity measurement in therapeutic sessions. Each of us are going to take about 15 minutes. We will do some questions immediately after, a couple minutes worth. And then hopefully we'll still have a few minutes left at the end for a broader discussion. If you do have questions, there are microphones numbered around the room. We ask that you go to them, identify yourself, the country that you're from, and then ask your succinct question. So those are the rules of the game. Let's get going. So my task first is to talk about global physical activity transition, the evidence and implications. Again, I'm Mark Tremblay. I'm the director of the Healthy Active Living and Obesity Research Group at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario Research Institute in Ottawa, Canada, where I'm also a professor of pediatrics in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Ottawa, and I'm the chief scientific officer of Active Healthy Kids Canada. So this is the essence of what I want to conceptualize for people. This diagram, let me work you through this. So on the top, we've got low and middle income countries, okay? And the axis is activity energy expenditure. So low and middle income countries today, roughly, in the year 2000, and I've conveniently categorized the total activity energy expenditure into four convenient categories: school or occupational physical activity, domestic activity, meaning chores, hygiene, cooking, transportation-related physical activity, and then leisure time physical activity. Leisure time being your discretionary stuff, playing sports, for example, going to aerobics class. And so you'll see in the top column, and notice the distribution of the categories of physical activity, but also notice the length. So it's my thesis that low and middle income countries today generally have higher rates of activity energy expenditure than high income countries. Also that the distribution of the activities within those change. So if you go down this slide to high income countries a century ago, is that showing up there? There we are. You can see that I believe, and I believe the data support this, that total activity energy expenditure, daily activity energy expenditure is reduced, but the fractionalization is roughly the same. Then if you go to the bottom bar, which I express high-income countries today, you can see a further truncation in the total amount of activity energy expenditure, but I think even more importantly is where the activity energy expenditure has disappeared from. Because our intervention strategies as clinicians, as exercise physiologists, as public health people, tend to lie almost singularly in the leisure time physical activity category, which I would argue, if anything, across time has increased. And so this is what I'm referring to as a physical activity transition. And these low and middle income countries are going to flow through this sort of entropy of movement and end up where high income countries are now, with exploding rates of obesity, accelerated rates of chronic disease, increased rehabilitative challenges, poor outcomes from rehabilitation, and so forth. So that's the essence of it. So using this model of studying other cultures as a way to go back in time. And so you may not believe that previous slide empirically, but we've done some work to try and substantiate that. As much as it's very difficult to go back in time, what you can do is look at other cultures that seem to live a lifestyle that a developed world did some time ago. So here's data that we have collected, directly measured data from pedometers or accelerometers on contemporary living Canadian children, old order Amish children, which are populations in certain parts of the world that live without the conveniences of things like electricity, vehicles, and then kids living in rural Kenya. And so as much as we can use this cross-cultural comparison as a way to go back in time, the previous slide seems to be substantiated by this step count information. And this is just what I'm trying to get at again here. Here, Mommy and Michael and Lindsay come in our house and play, all right. They come in and they plunk down in front of an electronic screen. This is a transition that has occurred in the last 30, 40 years. This didn't happen when I was a child. Okay, it wasn't as enticing or there were better things to do. It's also substantiated, this physical activity transition, by evidence of fitness. And in Canada, we've been fortunate enough just recently to complete almost 30-year follow-up on the fitness of the nation. So in 1981, we directly measured a nationally representative sample of Canadians in the Canadian Fitness Survey. And we repeated that in the Canadian Health Measures Survey just recently. So from 81 to 2009, we have the same measures on a nationally representative sample of Canadian children and youth. We have it on adults as well. So what I'm going to show you here is the same as with adults. My orientation is with children, and I think your business is increasingly going to be kids seeing you earlier than they should for things they shouldn't be seeing you for at all. Now, you're not going to be able to see this, despite the fact this is a mammoth screen, probably. But what I'm trying to convey here are the results. So on the left, you see a silhouette of a typical 12-year-old boy and girl in Canada in 1981. On the right, a silhouette of a typical 12-year-old Canadian boy or girl in 2009. It's subtle differences, but there are morphologic differences between those two, and they're substantiated in each of the lines. But let me summarize that for you. Canadian children are taller, heavier, fatter, rounder, weaker, and less flexible today than they were in 1981. Statistically and importantly different. These results forecast accelerated non-communicable disease development, increased healthcare costs, and loss of future productivity. Not good news. Might be good future productivity for yourselves, but not on a country level. In Canada, I mentioned that I was the Chief Scientific Officer of Active Healthy Kids Canada. We produce, for the last 7 years, an annual report card on the physical activity of children and youth in the country. How are we doing as a country? Are our kids active enough? And consistently, year after year, we assign a failing grade. As childhood obesity rates rise, childhood type 2 diabetes rates rise, physical activity levels decline, fitness levels decline. There's not much good news that we can find with the most robust evidence that we have available. So I find this anonymous quote quite striking. We spend the first 2 years of life teaching kids to walk and talk, and then the next 16 years telling them to sit down and shut up. Here's one of these spoof slides. Reality, the worst game ever. And this is the truth, though. This is what we're competing with. When we're trying to talk to kids and counsel kids to stay active and live healthy lifestyles and so on, when there's these mammothly enticing, readily available, omnipresent games that are super entertaining. It's just they almost always require us to sit, and they provide for us to sit and eat incidentally when we otherwise don't need to. We need to make reality a little bit better somehow. And so in response to these things, we're seeing a global movement towards development or redevelopment of physical activity guidelines, public health guidelines to try and initiate a change, a pushback against the physical activity transition. Here are a whole bunch of them. And this is from Wales, the British Association for Sport and Exercise Science, from England, from Scotland, from Australia, European Union as a group did it recently. The US, Canada, recently came out with new physical activity guidelines, and most recently, just in late 2010, the World Health Organization, for the first time, came out with global recommendations on physical activity for health. So it's sort of reached prime time as an issue, this need to preserve and promote healthy active living. Not that it hasn't been around for a long time, it's just I'm not sure we have decayed to a sufficient extent that we're giving the prominence the issue deserves. And so what are the implications of this? Well, you get all kinds of graphic comics and so on. There are severe implications of this, of course, and especially in low and middle income countries where their health is relatively preserved from lifestyle diseases at the moment. I'll talk about that more in the next presentation. So how's the internet changed my life? Made things easier for us, didn't it? And that should be a warning sign all the time. I'll talk about this a little bit more when I go into the Kenya presentation. Oh, but it's so much easier. And easier almost always means acceleration of disease and disability. So I won't go through this. There's all kinds of problems associated with this lifestyle transition that ends up with less movement, more obesity, accelerated chronic disease, orthopedic problems, musculoskeletal problems, etc. And so I think as physical therapists, we need to consider, and maybe you're already doing this in your practice, but we need to consider the whole movement continuum and the whole 24 hours of the day. I'm an exercise physiologist. This is the world I come from. And you typically study moderate to vigorous physical activity or high-intensity physical activity from a variety of perspectives. There is a growing discipline of sedentary physiology. This is, I would say, 90% of what my laboratory does now. And it's not simply the other end of the exercise physiology continuum. It is a completely separate and distinct area of study with completely separate and distinct biological processes activated and deactivated. Okay, that area and that area. And perhaps most importantly to you as clinicians is this little bubble in the middle that we call non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Incidental movement, lifestyle embedded behaviors, all the stuff that fits in between everything else. We pay little attention to it, and I think it's at our own peril, and I think it's at the demise or suboptimal rehabilitation of your patients. So here's brand new data, haven't even been published except in the Active Healthy Kids Canada report card, taking the most active part of the population, kids, school-aged kids, the most active time of the day after school, the 3-hour window after school. And this shows you what actually happens when you measure with accelerometers what the kids are doing. Okay? 59% is in sedentary pursuits, meaning virtually no movement at all. 33 in non-exercise activity thermogenesis, light activity, and a little sliver in moderate to vigorous physical activity. So you can imagine if we look at the adults for the whole day, what this looks like. It ends up 75% sedentary, a little bit of non-exercise activity thermogenesis, almost no movement. Directly measured, this is us robust Canadians. Okay? So this is the situation. Let's get some further guidance from Homer Simpson. We can all relate to him. Here's a day in the life of Homer Simpson. 30-minute sitting, drive to work. Hard day at the office. Drive home. Some quality family time. Was this an active day? I mean, he hasn't moved, right? So, no. But, if he does this, he meets any physical activity guideline from any country in the world. So we would say yay, right? I mean, if any questionnaire or even in talking to your patient, are you active? His answer would be yes. Check that box off, nothing further to think about. But surely, the other 23 and a half hours of that day matter. He could have been a lumberjack, but he wasn't, right? There's a lot of difference there. Could have been a good sleeper, a bad sleeper, whatever. So our physical activity guidelines cluster around 30 minutes. The other 96 or 98% matter. Do you think about those when you're counseling patients? Why do we focus on the 2% and not the 98? And then when we focus on the 2%, we're at risk of inciting behavior compensation. So we get the person to exercise when they fundamentally don't want to exercise, but it's good for them, it helps their rehabilitation. And then they reward themselves by doing even less through the rest of the day because they've done their exercise. And that can be in the form of reduced incidental activity. It can be in the form of an extra snack or something like that, such that your intervention might be, in fact, counterproductive. It might be obesogenic and reduce total activity. It still may have some therapeutic benefit in itself, but we shouldn't be disregarding all the rest of the time. So let me show you in this slide, which is a little bit busy, but so I've got activity energy expenditure in kilocalories along the y-axis and a number of pyramid bars along the x-axis. So a typical sedentary adult, 175 centimeters, 80 kilos, will have around 700, 750 kilocalories of activity energy expenditure. A sedentary adult. A little bit of that might be active transportation. The majority of it is stuff, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Me waving my arms here, standing up, sitting down, washing your hair, doing the dishes, making supper. So the person comes in to see you and they've got a musculoskeletal injury and you say, you know what, you're also overweight, you would really benefit by trying to lose a little bit of weight, get more active. And so what you do is you intervene with exercise 3 to 5 times per week, 30 to 40 minutes each time, 150 to 200 kcals, 3-4 times a week, something like that. That's your classic exercise prescription. And will typically result in some health benefits. That's the little red bar that I'm adding on the top of there. It's usually a structured type of approach, so it often requires a person to spend some money to go somewhere, to be with people. And what I'm suggesting is quite often when we do that, we end up with the third bar. The person does it, feel good about themselves. Okay, I walked 5 kilometers. I don't usually do that. I'm going to go home. I'm just going to chill out for the rest of the day. And I might just have that extra ice cream bar that I have in the freezer. So that your net intervention is the opposite direction of what you want. And what I'm suggesting is that we give more consideration to the final bar here, and this is why I add the third dimension here, that the intervention possibilities to introduce inconvenience into your life, anywhere, anytime, all the time, everywhere, creates enormous therapeutic potential for muscle contractions, for stretching, for a little bit of heart rate variability, blood pressure variability. And my guess is most of you don't counsel people in that regard, don't pay enough attention to that. So should we be counseling on reducing autodependency and car time? And is this part of your vernacular? Reducing nature deficit disorder, this cocooning inside, which has happened in the most recent generation, resulting in, among other things, lack of vitamin D. Should we be counseling on reducing indoor time, reducing screen time, reducing chair time, By the way, sometimes at this point some people start standing up in the audience, and you're welcome to do that if you'd like. Or other indices of sedentary behaviors. There are a number of initiatives going on right now around the world. I'm just putting a couple of these up just to highlight that. The U.S. last year came out with a comprehensive national physical activity plan. Many of the European countries have it. Other countries have it. Some that don't in the developing world will as a result of the new WHO global recommendations. The new Toronto Charter came out, and subsequent to the Toronto Charter coming out, there's now a document with best practice recommendations on how to increase population physical activity. So I put that up just to say that I think the issue has reached prime time. Massive numbers of people are being influenced by the physical activity transition that's occurring. So what are the issues and opportunities? People around the world are moving less, gaining weight, and accelerating chronic disease onset. This has implications for PTs, both in the patients they see and in their therapeutic outcomes. The global movement of physical activity guidelines for primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention is underway. Are PTs at the table? I sit on those WHO groups. I've been the advisor for the UK group. I wrote the Canadian ones. I was part of the US ones. PTs were not at any of those tables. The emergence of sedentarism as a public health threat. Is this a part of your clinical vernacular? Should it be? Should PTs be part of the anti-sedentary police? You must be aware of behavior compensation and non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Do you currently assess and prepare contingency plans for this when you intervene? The global physical activity transition has arrived. Should healthy active living assessment, management, and intervention be more prominent in the PT practice? And what are the implications of that? Barack Obama said, change will not come if we wait for some other person or some other time. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the change we seek. And with that, I'll finish my presentation and take just a couple minutes for questions if there are any. And again, I meant to say as well early on, this is my new thing that I've copied from Jim Zellis from the U.S., but if at any point you do feel inclined to clap, feel free to elevate that to a standing ovation and get yourself at least moving a little wee bit. Makes the speaker feel really good and reduces your sedentary behavior just a little bit. Have we got any questions? Agree? Disagree? Yes.
Ann Newstead, United States. I am standing up to get some exercise.
There you go.
Physical activity. And this is an area I've been very interested in for several years now, and was wondering what differences you've seen when people, seasonal differences, I guess, is what I'm asking. Have you seen differences as people go through different seasons of the year, especially in Canada where it gets cooler? San Antonio, where I'm from, it gets hotter, so we have some challenges when seasons change. Thank you.
Yeah, good question, and we certainly see differences. They don't align with yours necessarily. So in Canada, our winter months, physical activity levels are much lower than in the summer months. Relates to cold, relates to probably as much to darkness as anything else, because it's dark by late afternoon. In Canada, it doesn't get light again until late morning. I think compounded on top of that, there are seasonal affective disorders that occur as a result of the darkness, and so people cocoon further inside their homes and so on. So it certainly is a problem. You know, I think sometimes from a policy perspective, we're also our own worst enemies on some of these things, because I believe that we can stay robust by introducing inconvenience in our lives. That includes shoveling your driveway. Which is something that very few Canadians do anymore. It's all machine-driven. It's in part supported through cardiology groups that are afraid of middle-aged men like myself, overweight, having heart attacks while shoveling the driveway. And so it's just an example, and there are other examples in Canada, where we've almost conditioned the population to be frail. And when you do that, of course, they become frail. They become weaker. and cocoon further in and do less and less. So I think there's opportunities even from a policy perspective to try and overcome some of the seasonal differences we see. Okay, we'll just take two more, one here and then there.
David McAdams, Australia. What does the thermogenesis refer to in the NEAT acronym?
It just means an increase in energy expenditure, the burning of calories. Yeah.
Tom Peterson from Denmark. I like the idea of getting more activity into your everyday life instead of exercise, but have you actually been measuring the physiological impact of that approach in comparison with the exercise approach?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I would ask the audience, for people that research in this area, have you? And the answer is typically no. What happens is, typically in research in this area, someone puts a line in the sand. Eventually, thank goodness, someone puts a line in the sand. Surgeon General in the U.S. in 1996 says 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity most days of the week. That then became the basis of 1 million master's theses, looking at 0 compared to 30 and reinforcing that, 30 is better than 0. And the odd time you'll get someone doing 60 and you find out, 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity is better than 30. Very few people go beyond that, but I'll bet you anything 90 minutes is better than 60. And I'll bet you 15 minutes is better than 0, but not as good as 30. But those types of studies haven't been done, and I know you're asking more about the intensity thing. It's the same thing with intensity. Not many people have looked at this stuff. Now, in our laboratory, we've got controlled studies going on right now in children where we put them in the lab under 3 different conditions right now. This is going on with one of my PhD students. One where they come in and they sit all day. We put a catheter in, we measure sequential samples throughout the day, and they sit all day. We have a standardized meal set up. And these are randomized, another time they come in and we just simply interrupt their immobility. The way I was asking for standing ovations, okay? So if you're watching your movie, every 15 minutes be sure you stand up. All kinds of information coming out of Australia in particular showing that there's cardiometabolic benefits just to interrupting sedentary behavior. And then a third scenario where you add on the exercise. Now it seems like there's little doubt that exercise, it provides huge benefit, provided there's no behavior compensation at the other end. But what we're seeing is high active, high sedentary kids, which are showing poorer metabolic profile than kids that live a typical, active life with some exercise there. So I'm not sure if I answered your question. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. Now we're going to move on to the presentation by Dr. Onywera and myself. The emerging evidence of the physical inactivity and childhood obesity in Kenya. And this really builds on my previous talk, and I went over, so I'm going to make this one shorter. Dr. Onywera is a senior lecturer at Kenyatta University, where I'm a visiting lecturer. We're co-founders of the Kids Can Research Alliance, I'll speak to briefly in this presentation, and co-founders of Healthy Active Kids Kenya, a Kenyan counterpart to Active Healthy Kids Canada, of which I mentioned a short time ago. And it's very interesting how different it is in this country, which is its health issues are dominated by the prevention of HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, more concerned generally around stunting than around obesity, but very clearly a transition occurring in this country. So an organization like Healthy Active Kids Kenya had never existed before, was not in the psyche of the public health realm there, needs to be, I believe, rather than waiting for the problem to perpetuate and then try and resolve it. We know we're not very good at that. So for those that don't know, there's Kenya there in East Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. You know it. If you haven't been there, you know it for one thing probably, although there are other things you should know it for. They have great tea. But you know it for their distance runners. 800 meters to the marathon. If they're in the race, they're almost certainly going to win. And they've dominated this. And this makes it particularly important from a national identity that if what has happened is in Canada and the U.S. and other developed countries where we've got more than a quarter of our kids overweight and obese, if that happens to the kids of the Kalenjin tribe where most of these runners come from, the possibility of losing their whole national identity is there. I think this is very serious. There's some of the reasons for their endurance excellence, favorable environmental conditions which encourage an active lifestyle, certainly in the rural areas, a traditional Paleolithic diet, favorable anatomical and physiologic characteristics, a culture of running excellence and expectation to win. Most of the good runners live at altitude between 7,000 and 9,000 feet. Kenya, however, is experiencing an obesogenic environment quite recently, which is, I think, a great reason to use it as a natural experiment. An environment that encourages the overconsumption of energy-dense foods without engaging in physical activity. The trend is starting to be evident in Kenya now, and the problem is compounded by social beliefs and societal expectations, and I'll elaborate on that. These social beliefs, so I suspect most people here are from developed parts of the world where we know obesity is generally not something that's desired, not something you try and get to. Whereas it's quite the opposite there. It indeed is exactly what you want to get to, because it's a sign of success. It's a sign of prestige, of prominence, of privilege. Your job and level of education must match public opinion and expectations, and so the more successful you are, the larger you should be. You've been a good husband if you have a big, round wife. You've provided well for her, and the same thing for their children. So family members are supposed to be fat as a sign of wealth, health, good life. Fat children are an indicator of a wealthy family. This is something you would desire. So I find it just critically important that we get in with social marketing campaigns to this whole area of the world, Africa in general, but other parts of the world as well, and intervene to say, be careful about that, because soon you'll be able to be all fat, okay, and inactive, and eat unhealthy, and have all the consequences that go along with that. They're becoming technophiles there. There's certainly, in the last 10 years, been an explosion of cell phone use. There's still many areas of the country that have no electricity, certainly no video games, plasma screen TVs, and so on. But cell phones that can be used for almost anything. And so you'll hear things like, oh, I didn't have to go to the bank because I can make the transaction on my cell phone. It's so much easier. It is. But going to the bank to make that transaction used to cost them 3,500 steps. It doesn't anymore. Okay, I'm not saying that we want to keep primitive cultures primitive, but we need to do a health assessment of the consequences of making everything easier. When we make everything easier, we deteriorate physiologically. And so this is showing up in the scientific literature there. This is from the East African Medical Journal. Dietary patterns and nutritional status of preschool children in Nairobi. Concludes, there are a number of key challenges related to culture and the relationship between socioeconomic factors that require addressing by health professionals, dietitians, and health educators to ensure the delivery of successful health outcomes. So it's starting to be thought about. That was, I think, a 2006 paper. Here at 2004 in Health and Place. Fat, rich, and beautiful, changing sociocultural paradigms associated with obesity risk, nutritional status, and refugee children in sub-Saharan Africa. It concludes, nutrition challenge among school children in urban Kenya is shifting to overweight and obesity from undernutrition and stunting. There's a need for policymakers and health professionals to give special attention to the issue of childhood obesity, especially now when they're still down here in the low part of the curve. Okay? It's going to be exponential. Okay? Typically we wait until this happens and we get up there and we have a crisis. And we intervene massively and so on. We try and rehabilitate an entire population, rarely with success. Prevention is the best route. These are the sorts of things that are in the newspapers. Just look at the dates of these. This is 2010. Big bellies lock Kenyan youths from army jobs. How junk food is creating a colony of overweight children in Kenya. Obesity in Kenyan schools. This really, I mean, if somehow we could go back a decade and show these slides to leaders of that country, they would mock us. This is a ridiculous assertion in their country. And here's the projections from the World Health Organization. You can see 1990 over here, projection to 2020 over here. So about 50% of the burden of disease is communicable diseases in 1990. Around a quarter of non-communicable diseases. And see across a 30-year transition the projections, the transition that's going to occur. And some believe, indeed, the infectious diseases will remain. We still won't overcome them. So you're going to have this double-edged sword of infectious disease, of undernutrition, of malnourishment, of stunting kids, and the sort of dichotomous population. You're going to have overweight, obesity, heart disease, type 2 diabetes occurring over here in a country that can't sustain its current health care. In fact, an area of the world that currently can't sustain its health care. And so, partially in response to this, or in anticipation of this, we created the Kenyan International Development Study Canadian Activity Needs, Kids Can Research Alliance, about 6 years ago. The objective of Kids Can is to promote and facilitate research on the determinants and predictors of childhood obesity, exploit the timing of the current childhood obesity crisis in Canada and the nutrition and physical activity transition occurring in Kenya, develop and foster a long-term international partnership and research alliance, and to serve as a model and nucleus for expansion of international partnership to other countries. So we went and actually did some data collection, some of which I showed you in my presentation on the step counts. But we collected anthropometric measures and physical activity measures. This is the weight status stuff. Rural Kenya in blue, urban Kenya, meaning Nairobi, in the reddish. You can see on the overweight and obese column here and here, there are no kids that we measured overweight or obese from rural Kenya. Little bit in urban Kenya. Canadian numbers for overweight would be 18% and 8% for obese. Huge difference. So there is some merit to using this model to study going back in time and trying to prevent the same mistakes from being made. Here's the weight status for girls, more or less the same. Still some stunting problems in rural Kenya. This is their screen time, and notice the units, hours per week, not per day, okay? And so in rural Kenya, 2/3 of the kids have no screen time. In Canada and the U.S., it's between 6 and 7 hours a day, so between 40 and 50 hours a week. Huge difference. But you can see as much as urbanization is a microcosm of globalization, it's sort of the preface to changes to come, you can see the changes that are occurring. Far more kids in urban settings are spending increased time in front of screens. Of course, they have electricity. They have access to this. It makes sense. Is it a good thing? If we look at even active transportation in rural areas, almost all the kids walk or run, very few bike to school. Okay, you can see in this column here. A few, around 10%, are passively transported, but if you look in the urban centers, it's around 60 or 70% that are passively transported. So again, as much as that going from rural to urban is a part or an example of a globalization transition that's occurring, I think there's good evidence for our theory. So on May 5th of this year in Nairobi, we released the first Kenyan report card on the physical activity and body weight of children and youth, modeled after the Active Healthy Kids Canada report card, trying to get in at the front end, a country that is still fundamentally healthy in terms of their lifestyle behaviors, but are starting down a very slippery slope. And we wanted to get it into the news and so on. We were successful, front page news with the release of this, and so hopefully we've got some of the public health people thinking about preserving the health of their population, their future athletes and so on, instead of waiting until the crisis is there and trying to fix it. It's the first of its kind in Kenya, the report card. It provides baseline on the state of affairs on physical activity patterns and weights of Kenyan children and youth. The goal of the report card is to highlight the areas where Kenya is succeeding as a nation and emphasize areas where more action is needed. We provided examples of how to improve the grade. And so the idea here is to try and create, within a country that has been dealing with health issues that are not typical to the Western world, more communicable disease issues, undernutrition and so forth, we want to create a culture of wellness that brings in the attention of government, the health sector, the corporate sector, the family, the schools, the mass media, to get them start talking about healthy active living and the preservation of healthy active living before it disappears and we have to talk about the resurrection of healthy active living. So, in conclusion, Kenya, like many developing countries, is going through a rapid physical activity and nutrition transition. Kenyan children in urban settings appear to be showing signs of the nutrition and physical activity transition, while others are showing signs of stunting and wasting It's a double-edged sword. The transition in Kenya will have serious implications for PTs and other health professionals in the future, and hence call for attention. More research is needed to try and understand the determinants and predictors of childhood obesity and physical inactivity and their implications on PT practice and therapeutic outcomes in Kenya. There is a need to address physical inactivity and childhood obesity through physical activity therapies that are more convenient, attractive, and compatible with the needs, abilities, and interests of Kenyan children and youth. Awareness campaigns on healthy active living are needed in Kenya. We're working on those. There is an opportunity for PTs to play a greater role in the prevention, management, and treatment of conditions related to inactivity in Kenya. Thank you for your attention. I will mention as well that at the meetings that we had and at the release of the report card and the different groups that we've met with over the 5 or 6 years we've had Kids Can in place, there's been no presence of PT, no mention of PT, no mention of the whole profession in this cause, in this movement. I wonder if there isn't opportunity there. So thank you for your attention. Thank you, you're too kind. We have a couple minutes for questions if there are any.
Jenny Kellett from Australia. I'm just wondering how much influence you actually do have on governments as far as policy making, especially in comparison to large corporations who supply the junk food and all the technological equipment and things like that for children.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question was how much influence we advocates, scientists, researchers can have relative to the power of the corporate world and so on that have very different agendas. They want to sell the French fries and they want to sell the television sets and so forth. And I would say my experience, we have very little influence relatively. But I think we're gaining a foothold. And so in my first presentation, when I talked about global physical activity recommendations, countries coming out with new recommendations, even countries coming out with sedentary, specific public health sedentary recommendations, separate and distinct from physical activity ones, I think we're getting more shelf space in the public agenda. I think we're moving up the public agenda. I think international comparisons are very effective, and so in 2014 we're planning an international report card congress where we hope to have 15 or 20 countries release a report card on how they're doing so that we're right there doing a matrix of cross-country comparisons. I know that when we released the Canadian report card, the BBC has covered it a few times, the Americans have covered it a few times. They love to say that Canada is failing in the physical activity of their kids, and our politicians hate when something like that is said. It's embarrassing and so on. So there's no doubt it's a David and Goliath type of situation against the corporations, and the point is well taken that, most of the social forces are encouraging us to move less and eat more. Right? And almost everything. This Christmas you will all buy something that will be convenience oriented. Whether it's a new electronic thing that doesn't require you to do this, or a new voice-activated thing that doesn't require you to do that. So we're swimming against the current for sure. But that doesn't mean we give up. And that's why, like when we go to Africa and look, and these kids, we can save hundreds of millions of people from making the mistakes that we've made. And it's not just body weight, but it's healthy active living. As the fast food chains arrive, as electricity, as electronics arrive, and so on, these people will be fascinated by it, and they've always admired it because that's what the Western world has. Isn't that what we aspire to? And it's like in moderation, that has to get, the message has to get out in moderation. So thank you for your attention. Now we're going to move on. Obuchi. Dr. Obuchi graduated from Tokyo National Hospital School of Rehabilitation. He received his physical therapist license from the Japanese government. His graduate training was from Georgia State University, where he obtained his MSc from the School of Allied Health Sciences. His doctoral degree was received from the Graduate School of Medicine at Kitasato University. He is the leader of the Department for Prevention of Dependence on Long-Term Care at the Tokyo Metropolitan Institute of Gerontology and professor at Waseda University and Tokyo Metropolitan University. He is fully committed to elderly health policy in Japan and Tokyo Metropolitan Government. Dr. Obuchi has published extensively in the areas of prevention of frailty in the elderly population and biomechanics of geriatric movements. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Obuchi.
Chairperson and distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to having my presentation here. Before I start my presentation, I'd like to express my sincere thanks for your support to Japan. Although Japan lost a lot of things by the terrible disaster, but we got a lot of warm heart from all over the world. We are now in transition to be normal life, but I believe we are all okay because of your support. Again, arigato for your kind support to Japan. Now, I'm going to start my presentation. Today I'm going to talk about physical activity measurements in well-aged country. First of all, I'd like to ask you one question. Do you believe that westernized lifestyle is the problem? Likewise, McDonald's have been symbolized as bad habit eating. You may believe that westernized lifestyle is considered to be bad, but it is not always true. Japan gets longevity because of the westernized lifestyle. This slide is age-adjusted mortality rate of Japan. X coordinates represents a year from 1950 to 2005. Y coordinates represent rate of mortality. Please notice year around 1965. You may observe significant decrease in CVA death after this year and CHD as well. What happened around these years? Did we reduce food or did we quit driving cars? On the contrary, we increased food intake and motorization. This slide shows food intake after World War II. On the contrast to decreased CVA, you may notice the significant increase in meat intake and dairy product intake here. It's kind of opposite. So you may, hardly understand that westernized lifestyle is bad, but truth is our longevity is coming from this kind of westernized lifestyle. Japan has been accepting westernized lifestyle, but we reduce a lot of risk from common disease. I think, your country as well. Westernized lifestyle is not a problem, but excessively westernized lifestyle is the problem. As you see here, we stopped increase the meat and dairy intake after 1995 here. Without particular healthcare activity, in other words, in natural. As a result, we overcome Western countries in longevity. But you still fearful risk of CHD or CVD. I'd like to ask you not to believe advertisements. There is a lot of information making people be scared for risk of common disease. But most of them are sponsored by drug company. They are making money by increasing fear for common disease. This is a comparison among OECD countries by obese population in adults. Obesity in Japan is only 3% here. I myself, I am one of it, so that I am a statistically significant rare person in Japan. Please notice, Italy and French are culturally recognized as rich food, but their rate is only 9%. It's difficult to conclude these things from here, but I think, food intake is not the problem. But, if the country has rich intake of food, it may not have that much big problem. On the contrary, USA and UK, Mexico has a great number. Anyway, as a result of enough westernized lifestyle, we got ultimate longevity over the world. However, we faced a new problem, that is physical and mental decline due to aging. This slide shows a cause of dependency. Though there are CVA, CHD here, physical frailty and accidental fall, arthritic problem, and cognitive decline are the major cause of dependency. We call this as a geriatric syndrome. Geriatric syndrome is not a disease, but is a natural aging process. However, it will be exaggerated by inactive lifestyle. If your country has average lifespan less than 75 years old, you may not have big trouble with the geriatric syndrome. But if your country has average lifespan over the 75 years old, you may very carefully and seriously notice this geriatric syndrome. As you see here, over 60% of the people aged over 85 become dependent because of geriatric syndrome. Here, I'd like to make a quick summary. If the country lifespan is about 40 years old, infectious disease will be the main healthcare issue. If the lifespan is about 60 years, common disease will be the main issue. And if the lifespan is about 80 years, geriatric syndrome will be the main issue. Please notice that healthcare issue should and must be moved with people. I have used much time to explain background, but now let's move on to the main theme. What kind of physical activity measurements are important in such well-aged country? This is a comparison of maximum walking speed between who became instrumental ADL dependent and who did not after 1 year of observation. This orange bar represents who became IADL dependent, and the other bar represents who did not become dependent. As you see here, no IADL dependent person was observed who walked faster than the average. There is nothing. I believe that we do not need to specific measurement even if we become more aged society. But important thing is make regular functional check for all, like as blood sampling or blood pressure measurement. Likewise, grip strength, one leg standing time, functional reach, timed up and go, and knee extension, as well as walking speed are also useful for assessment of geriatric syndrome. This is pretty much basic for PT, but it is very strong tool to detect and assess geriatric syndrome. As the society grows old, it means there are more chance to have disability. I do not think it appropriate, but from functional point of view, it may be considered as most of population become PT client in the well-aged society. So people need more access to PT. But one thing I'd like to mention is that please distinguish between disease and aging. Geriatric syndrome is not a disease. We have to give them more choice and more to consider about their will. Since we are treating frail older person, our thoughts will be biased. Older persons are not process of decline, but they are in process of growth. I have a friend whose name is Shuichi, age 78. He climbed Chomorama, highest mountain in the world, when he was age 75. And he is preparing for another climbing at age 80. Please look at older people in broad. There are a lot of persons who are active than you. I'd like to share another specific situation in Japan. We are expecting to have 40% of elderly persons in population in 2040. The prevalence is about twice as the developed countries. You can see your future just looking Japanese present. In addition, population of productive age will be significantly dropped after year 2000. We are going to have older person twice, whereas we are going to productive population half. There is the same slide for Sweden. There is no decrease in number of productive population. To keep Japan vital as it is, we have to promote elderly person more active and more productive. To do so, we may need to invent quantitative measurement to measure their productivity for the community instead of money, but it is not ready yet. In Japan, every person who have geriatric syndrome have an access to exercise. If the person needs more professional assistance, they are able to see physical therapists. Although we just started this system 4 years ago, we reduced incidence of dependent persons significantly after here. You may see decrease in speed after year 2008, although our growth of elderly population is accelerating. In conclusion, please stop one moment before you believe westernized lifestyle is bad. You may not need to so scared about obesity or metabolic syndrome, but you may need to more notice on geriatric syndrome. Capitalism is powerful to make people blind. Since the medication of the common disease is a major source of money, people are tricked easily. Please notice that geriatric syndrome is as a next generation healthcare issue, and we have to cure it like common disease. In addition, we need to promote older person more active and more productive for good. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
In your comparison of obesity between countries, you didn't mention the actual volume of food that some countries, or the people in some countries may eat compared to those in the countries that have less obesity. For example, in France, I know from living there that the volume of food that they eat is much less than what a typical person would eat in America.
Right. That in France it's 9% here. 9%. Italy 9%. USA, UK is over 20%. So I think, USA and the UK is kind of different to other countries.
I think the comments, Shuichi, related, because you made the comment that those are countries that eat rich foods, but still have low percentages. And I think the comment was, but perhaps they're more reasonable portion sizes. Is that? Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't mention that the portion of the size, but if you eating the different kind of foods, you cannot eat it's very difficult to take much energy. But if you take donut, and it's easy to get the energy by itself. So to me, portion is not so a big problem. We have to have different kind of food. That's my conclusion.
I can't comment on the actual studies off my head, but I do believe that, for example, Japanese people who live in America take on then very similar morphological body weights and things like that.
Right.
They're Americans.
There is a Honolulu heart study, and we are, Japanese ancestors over there, but they have a same obesity problem, so that, that the culture of the food intake is the problem.
Shuichi, I just had a question, and this is one I've brought up at many conferences when we get presentations on the different age groups. So I presented largely child focus and making the case for how the world in which our children of today are growing up is remarkably different than the world where our current elders grew up. So our current elder population was born in the 1920s, 30s, and had a remarkably different childhood, remarkably different exposure to food, to movement, to healthcare, to all kinds of things. And so it always worries me when we plan for the future based on the cohort that's there now, because I don't think it reflects the cohort to come. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. Actually, the younger population in Japan has an undernutrition problem, especially in female. The male is okay, but female has decreased their intake because they want to be beautiful. That's a problem. So the nutrition in Japan did not more consider about obesity things for the children right now.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, the final speaker in this session before we open up for discussion is Professor Esko Malkia. Esko Malkia has been a full professor in physiotherapy at the University of Jyväskylä since 1998. He received a BA in special education, BSc in physical education, MSc in exercise physiology, LSc in health sciences and exercise physiology, and PhD in health sciences from the University of Jyväskylä, as well as a diploma from the School of Physical Therapy from Jyväskylä. Quite a few degrees there, Esko. He's been a supervisor of more than 160 master's theses and 10 dissertations in physical therapy at the University of Jyväskylä. He's been very involved with the WCPT over the years, and he has published more than 100 peer-reviewed papers, especially in the field of physical activity measurement and its applications to enhance health and to improve outcomes in rehabilitation. Please join me in welcoming Esko to the podium.
Thank you, Chair, and distinguished guests. It's nice to be here now because 2003 in Barcelona, when we had the last time in Europe World Congress, I was organizing that as a member of International Scientific Committee. Now I am retired from my professorship, and I hope that I have a time to do something else, not only organizing. Thank you. Okay, I start my presentation. First, the roots of physiotherapy are in exercise, which is very important to understand. Maybe Swedish delegates here accept that because it started 1813 in Sweden, at least this part of physiotherapy. So it has played very important part a long time. But I want to give some examples how we have tried to solve in clinical settings exercise, how we can prescribe dose and so on. So I must make some definitions first, because in science we need definitions. I give some definitions from measurements and activities, and then I discuss a little bit of effectiveness of physical activity intervention, and finally those examples of the studies. So my focus here is physiological. I stay in physiological definition, and so I omit social and educational context, but I understand that those are also very important, but now I must concern on physiological aspects. Metabolic rate is a basic measure of physical activity according to international standards. Many of you don't know these international standards, but there is an ISO standard, very well written standard, and it gives some rules to these basic measures. And this metabolic rate, it means energetic cost of muscular load, which is conversion of chemical energy into mechanical and thermal energy. Now when I am standing, it's mostly only thermal energy. So there are basic units, and watts per body size is a basic unit in this case of metabolic rate. But of course, quite often, like in Mark presentation, we use kilocalories and so on, but this is a basic measure, and it's a relative measure because it's a per body size. But since 70s we have used more and more relative metabolic rate measure or equivalent metabolic equivalent as a measure of intensity of physical activity. There are many different kind of definition how it's calculated, and I am not going to the details of that, but there is not only one way to do that. So power or intensity of physical activity or exercise can be expressed by MET values, and the amount of metabolic rate is force or volume, MET minutes, MET hours. There are many different indexes expressed in literature, but according to ISO standard, time-weighted average, it's the most important measure of that, because it reflects also the intensity and volume at the same time. It's quite similar like a PAL, physical activity level, but it's calculated per minute. I am not going into detail of this continuum there represented there in my slide, because it's a little bit complicated. And force or volume of physical activity is so expressed by MET hours. So we must understand that there is a net metabolic rate and gross metabolic rate. Like in Mark presentation, there was a need that's a little bit near this gross metabolic rate or something like that, more that. But we must remember that net metabolic rate is depending on the mode of activity, recruited muscles, intensity, duration of activity, and frequency. And gross metabolic rate includes resting metabolic rate, specific dynamic effect of food consumption, passive or spontaneous muscle activities. What about the physical activity measurements? We must remember one thing which is very important. All movements are equal in respect of measure of metabolic rate. They are equal. They are not different. Metabolic rate of movement is not depending on social surrounding. If you stand up here or if you stand up clapping at your work, so it's the same. So, for example, metabolic rate of walking depends on speed, terrain, slope, shoes, etc., but not if it is taken place at work, at home, in sport hall, or in the city on pavement. There are quite a lot of studies where has forgotten this. So physical activity, it's defined most often like here. Physical activity, so it's any bodily movement produced by contraction of skeletal muscles resulting in energy expenditure. So conversion of chemical energy into mechanical. But there are many activity times, subcategories, like also in Mark presentation was taken into consideration. But we must remember that there are only few % of physical activity what we can use therapeutic exercise. So you can see that it's like a puzzle. There are many different things. These occupational activities or daytime activities are the biggest part of that. And therapeutic activities, there is very little to use to those. Like on the left hand there, in our intervention we have used this kind of model, effective factors. So only 2 or 5% of total activity we can use for planned exercises. Most often we analyze more than 1 minute time period because anaerobic periods in normal life are not so important. These are only for sporting people. But quite often we are mixing these things. And 24 hours, 1440 minutes, 10,080 minutes a week. It's very important to remember that all time. There are classification of physical activity measurements. This is according to ISO standard, and it's based on accuracy of measurements. On the right hand, on the left hand, there is a classification, and on the right hand there is accuracy. And we see that screening is the lowest level. Rough information, it's a level when we use questionnaires, and most of epidemiological studies are based on this. So rough information, great risk of error. Observation is the next step. High error risk still, but diaries and such can be used there. But analyses like heart rate measures, accelerometer, temperature and so on are more important to use or validate those questionnaires via that way. What about the effectiveness of physical activity studies? Outcome measures, they are quite exact most often. There are very exact definitions of outcome measures. But what about the physical activity? Very rare they are metabolic rate, absolute or relative expressed. There are social or verbal descriptions about the physical activity. So it's very difficult to analyze what has been the real physical activity. Or there is a time in activities, or there are steps which is not telling physical activity, it's telling only one part of that. Many different units are equivalents. So we have a need, many analyses of possibilities or risk detection, but what can we change? The role of planned exercise. It was 5%. The meaning of other activities are quite often omitted. Measurement possibilities, there are a lot. I give some examples now from our measurements. First, 3 studies. Work capacity versus physical load with caregivers, so elderly people in Finland. The same model is fitting also to the people who are at work. It's no difference in that case. And we have expressed our result in ICF frame. And then there is exact dose response analysis of neck pain rehabilitation, and finally prevention of type 2 diabetes, the effect of exercise intervention. So quite large scale, but we use the same kind measurement systems, what we hope is quite precise. First, design and methods of this caregiver study. We had 16 caregivers, and we measured their physical capacity using so-called non-exercise questionnaire. Metabolic rate was analyzed during 24 hours. And here are ICF frame, how we expect and plan the study. We had body structure. So this ICF frame is fitting very well into activity studies also. And there is a maximum capacity, met capacity expressed by that way. Then there are activities, caregiving, walking and moving, recreation and leisure. And you see that there are code numbers also according to the ICF, and participation, social life. And we didn't forget also environmental factors or personal factors. So physical activity was measured 24 hours. We used the body scale, so-called body scale, as a measure of intensity, and we validate those expressions and diary of activities and classification of activities where caregiving, commuting, leisure time, physical activity, and so on. 24 hours activities converted into MET values. Senseware armband, accelerometer, where are also heat sensors were used to measure in our measurements, and then we use also diary. So we use this kind of computer program that we have a Senseware here, and we have a diary, and then we put all to the database as a MET values, and then we put them into our computer program, so-called METPro program, and then we get different indexes, and we were able to analyze quite precise all. And here are pragmatic results of this study. So here we can see that the highest ICF linked activity was moving around in different locations, so it gives range from 3.9 to 6.8 met, and we could conclude that caregivers' physical capacity must be about between 6 and 7 that they can execute their task in caregiving task. There are more other results, but I'm not going to details here. And then the next study, dose-response relationship of specific training to reduce chronic neck pain and disability. It was a randomized control study. Number of patients 180, female office workers, and they had neck pain for more than 6 months. We divided them to 3 groups: strength, endurance, and control, by different precise neck programs. And then we followed with them after institutional rehabilitation 12 months. And 1 month after that follow-up, we analyzed the physical activity and also the pain decrease in neck. And using this same model as I have shown already. So here is an example how we converted single exercises into the MET values. In this case, according to the dumbbell press weight, we changed it into the different METs according to our earlier studies. And here are the results. On the here is in X scale is energy expenditure of specific training MET hours, and here is a change in chronic neck pain. You see that here is a zero line, and we were able to observe that no other activities were associated with change in chronic neck pain except specific training. And we were able to recognize also there that there is a threshold, so real dose response threshold to the decrease in neck pain, and it's here. You see that even endurance and strength group have been behind this line, all in such case that they have their neck pain has decreased quite extensively. And so we were able to analyze, we were able to conclude that 8.75 MET hours specific training in a week is effective. It's about 3 times a week exercise, 45 minutes. And then the final study, this is a prevention study which is still going on, prevention of type 2 diabetes, the effect of exercise intervention, and here is a design. Again, we use the same model. It's quite useful when we use always the same aspect taken into the model. Randomized control study, number is 144 male who have a risk to have a type 2 diabetes, and 3 groups again: power type, strength training, Nordic walking control, and 12 weeks exercise, and exercise physical activity were collected using all-time recall questionnaire, diary, and SenseView Armband Pro measurements, which I have shown already. And as an outcome measure, we used impaired glucose tolerance and fasting glucose level, and also some physical measurements and blood lipid tests. And here is a model from our results, what we are waiting for, because this is not yet analyzed truly. I can't give any final results, but this is how we analyze it. So in this figure, we see that the treatment effect of exercise, which is here, is analyzed in such way that we analyze also if other physical activities to which those our test persons are exposed have it playing any role, have it any effect, confounding effect, or even treatment effect, compare it with exercise effect. And so there is a power and Nordic walking, and we suppose that maybe there is this kind of effect, but we don't know yet. So these three studies have been example how we can get the precise dose response measurements to the use of physiotherapy, because our ultimate aim has been, of course, to find also practical solution to clinical settings. Still, this methodology is a little bit time consuming, but we can develop it also. So if we want to change something, we must know what to change. And in physical activity, it means the understanding of the item of physical activity intensity. First we must understand what is the intensity, and volume, force. So nice to know is not enough. I think that many of our studies are still nice to know level. But so we can go further, and if you want more information of this, our methodology, you can take contact to me after these sessions. And so thanks to many people who has been involved in these studies. Thank you very much.
Do I stay here? So the floor is open to questions specifically to Professor Malkia, or more generally. The title of this focus session was Global Physical Activity Transitions, and then the question, Emerging Measurement and Therapeutic Opportunity. So if there are any comments or questions, if you believe that, if there is a physical activity transition occurring, whether or not it has any implications to the physical therapy profession in general or your practice in particular, and if so, what that is. Or are you quite content being sort of passive observers of what's going on globally, and whoever comes in the door to the clinic comes in the door to the clinic? Thoughts? Yes, number 3.
I have a question to Dr. Obuchi. In your study, you mentioned about the number of measurements to be the indicators of geriatric syndromes. I wonder, is there any specific figures, like what's the number of the TAG? It may be under 30 or 20 to 25. It's like, if you get that measure, that figure or the result, then you can say, okay, now you'll be careful about whether you're getting the geriatric syndrome. And another question is, I'm not so clear about what is geriatric syndrome is. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. You're asking, is there any normative value for these things, right? Actually, we do, but it's in Japanese. But if you want the normative value with you, I can translate into that. So come to me later. But important things is, when you get older, the age itself is not the main, dependent value. I mean, it's more lifestyle is the more effect to their quantity of their measurement. So, say if this value is about 20 years old, this value is about 30 years old, things like that is effective for from age 20 to the maybe 40 or 50. But if you go further, there is a lot of variation. It's not dependent on age. they are dependent on more physical activity itself. So I myself is not use, age value, things like that. What I'm doing is making the one value from 65 to the 100 years, then, categorized into 5 categories. And then, I recommend the patient that, you are right now this, line, so you have to keep one step up, things like that. So I have that kind of the normative value, so I can give it to you. So please come to me later. And the other things, geriatric syndrome is a kind of aging, but say you can have a white hair, but it's not affected to your life itself. But geriatric syndrome is aging things, but it affects to your life and mobility, things like that. So we call these things as a geriatric syndrome, and it is including physical frailty and mental frailty, and as well as incontinence, things like that. All right.
Thank you.
Dr. Tremblay, I'm wondering when we're trying to increase the physical activity during the day, other than exercise programs and things like that, is there things like active transport or some of those categories, is there one thing that's better than another that seems to be coming out as the way to go, like active transport, getting kids to walk to school and things like that?
Thanks for the question, a good question, and I don't think there's a simple answer because I think it's so situation dependent, age dependent, sometimes weather dependent, and so on. So I think it's really important for us to have a big bag of contingency plans in our physical activity arsenal, which is, if you remember the pyramid diagrams that I was showing, that's the value of the one on the far right is we can be active anywhere, anytime. I don't have to be sitting here. I can be standing up. I can walk over to the podium and make the call to you. And so because it's freezing rain outside and I can't walk to work or the kids can't walk to school that day, what other opportunities exist within the home, outside the home, in different ways? And so physiologically, the body doesn't know what you're doing. It doesn't know if you're indoors or outdoors unless there's some contaminants there. It doesn't know the context of what you're doing, and so the physiologic response, whatever health benefits are going to be, will be there no matter where and how you do it. And so I think the bigger question, rather than is there one thing that really works, is to develop an arsenal, to get it into our thinking, to introduce a little inconvenience into our lives. And like I said, there's remarkable research coming out just showing that interrupting extended sitting has cardiometabolic benefits. Like who would have thought? I mean, it's not going to have any impact on your 10K running time, but it's so simple to do, whether it's at your desk or throughout the conference. I was impressed actually here. The back earlier was full of people standing. You go to exercise physiology conferences, that's more and more the norm. There will be fewer people in the seats, more people standing. They're still paying attention, they're still taking notes, but they know the value of standing compared to sitting. Changing the postures throughout the day, going from one leg to the other. Again, these are not things that are going to make us athletes or whatever, but they're things that seem to produce health benefits. So I think we're best off trying to have an array of things that we know we can do. If we can actively transport, then let's do it. If we can stand when we otherwise would sit, let's do it. If we can walk when we otherwise would stand, let's do it. And can we convey that? I mean, can we role model that, but can we convey that to our patients? And I think every muscle contraction counts and will benefit them. So we're out of time, folks, but I would like to thank you for your attention and for being here. I would like to thank the speakers for their excellent presentations. And I'd like to invite those that are interested in this general area to another session this afternoon at 1:45 in the Emerald Room, where this type of discussion and the role of physical therapists in exercise prescription in particular, in overcoming the physical inactivity crisis, will be discussed in a panel discussion, so a lot of opportunity for back and forth with the audience. Thank you once again, and enjoy the conference.